Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. The White House is unveiling its most sweeping strategy yet to combat rising cases of COVID-19. It includes a new requirement that all companies with at least 100 employees mandate vaccinations or enforce routine testing. It also outlines vaccine requirements for certain healthcare providers and all federal employees and contractors. People who fail to comply will face disciplinary action, including possible termination. Limited exemptions will be allowed for certain disabilities or for religious objections. President Biden introduced the six-pronged approach Thursday.
We have the tools to combat the virus if we can come together as a country and use those tools. If we raise our vaccination rate, protect ourselves and others with masking, expanded testing, and identify people who are infected, we can and we will turn the tide on COVID-19. It'll take a lot of hard work. It's going to take some time. Many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated, even though the vaccine is safe, effective, and free.
And in the wake of America's departure from Afghanistan after 2 decades, the Taliban's promises of a more moderate government are failing to materialize. Despite that, Russia, China, and Iran appear poised to formalize relations with the incoming regime. China is offering the group $30 million in aid. Earlier, State Department spokesman Ned Price expressed concern over the initial appointments to the interim Afghan government.
We are not going to make sweeping categorical judgments just yet. We have spoken about our reaction to the initial caretaker government. You have heard us say that the lack of inclusivity, the track records, the backgrounds of some of the individuals involved is a cause for concern. It certainly does not reflect what the international community and what, as a part of that, the United States hoped to see.
The first passenger plane since the U.S.'s withdrawal was allowed to depart from Kabul on Thursday. Americans, Canadians, and British citizens were on board. What remains uncertain is the fate of Afghan citizens who assisted the United States in various capacities over the past 20 years. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Blinken announced accused the Taliban of not permitting flights to depart in violation of their agreement. Today, the White House defended itself after releasing a statement on the first international flight, which described the Taliban as businesslike.
We are here to celebrate the return of American citizens who wanted to leave Afghanistan, of legal permanent residents, of Afghans who fought by our side, to Qatar successfully on a Qatari Airlines flight. And in order to get those people out, we had to work with some members of the Taliban to press them and to work in a business-like manner to get them out. That is what we were stating in the statement.
And for the latest out of Washington, let's bring in Sarah Westwood and Jacqueline Alemany. Sarah is a political and investigative reporter for the Washington Examiner, and Jacqueline is the anchor of Power Up for the Washington Post. Welcome to you both. Sarah, let me start with you. This summer, President Biden called for most federal workers to be vaccinated or submit to regular coronavirus testing. Now they're imposing penalties for private companies. What is behind the shift in strategy?
I think there was a lot of optimism in the spring and leading into the summer when the vaccines were first starting to become available across the U.S. to anyone who wanted them, that more people were going to voluntarily take the dose. And so what you saw was state governments, local governments, and also the federal government trying to incentivize people with carrots and not sticks to take the shot. And I think what the Biden administration has learned over the past few months is that that is not going to get them to hit their vaccination targets. There are more holdouts of people who are reluctant to take the vaccine than I think public health officials in the Biden administration initially anticipated. So you see Biden imposing those stricter mandates, and he's really pivoting towards an issue here that has been successful for him in terms of his performance numbers. People in the spring, in the summer, gave him high marks in approval rating polls for his COVID management. That is why he enjoyed a much higher approval rating than he does now. Obviously, Afghanistan contributed tremendously to the decline that we've seen. This is really where Biden has arguably performed the most successfully in his presidency. It's talking about COVID. He's very good at being empathetic with people, about at least having the appearance of straight talking directly to members of the public. And that is what we are seeing from him today as he pivots back to talking about the pandemic. The criticism from the right, though, is that Biden hasn't really to date laid out a clear path back to normalcy. And that's what you're hearing from Republicans, from conservatives who say that, you know, Biden and other public health officials in his administration sort of led the public to believe that once the vaccine was widely available, businesses, schools, society at large could go back to some version of their lives before the pandemic. And that keeps getting kicked down the road without really a clear strategy for how these sorts of requirements and restrictions and testing and all of that can sort of start to ramp down. That's going to be the challenge for Biden, is to articulate what that new normal looks like, even as cases are still on the rise.
Right. That July 4th Independence Day speech really had this sort of celebratory kind of feel to it, even as there was, you know, caution preached about the fact that the pandemic was still ongoing. But a lot of Americans remember that very clearly as sort of a sense of perhaps that was the beginning of normality, and yet here we are as this pandemic goes on. Jackie, on another topic here, last week, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, a moderate, called for a strategic pause on President Biden's $3.5 trillion budget bill. He says it costs too much. And a new poll by Axios shows 6 in 10 Americans agree with him. So where do things stand now?
Right, Elaine, the Manchinima caucus that reporters are so closely watching, since those two senators on Capitol Hill in the Senate, Senators Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, ultimately have the power to make or break this reconciliation bill that's currently being drafted and marked up in the House Ways and Means Committee right now on Capitol Hill. They have made clear in recent weeks, while they've been on recess, that this price tag of $3.5 trillion is too big. Of course, you have progressive members in the Democratic chamber. I'm sorry, that is my feisty dog who wants me to take her out for a walk, who have been basically protesting Manchin and Kristen Sinema's undue influence, and saying that $3.5 trillion really should be the floor, which is a bit unrealistic. We've been pinging people outside of the government and Senate staffers and House staffers as well, trying to get an estimate of where they think this number is going to ultimately land. Some lobbyists have tossed out the number $2 trillion to us, but what that number ultimately comes to is very unclear, and it's not something that the House and the Senate have come to an agreement on yet. That being said, what the process looks like right now is the House is going to draft something probably amounting to $3.5 trillion. Again, as I noted earlier, the House Ways and Means Committee started their markup of that bill today. After that comes together and House Democrats are able to come to some sort of agreement on the pay-fors, they're going to pass it, and it'll go to the Senate, where then they'll be able to potentially make changes. So if you have someone like Joe Manchin who ultimately isn't on board with the final price tag, that's going to be a problem for Democrats in this piece of ambitious legislation that is really key to the Biden agenda overall. But I think it's also important to note that Manchin said that he's open to spending more. He just needs to see the fine print here.
All right, we'll see how that continues to develop. Meantime, Sarah, today the Justice Department announced it is suing the state of Texas over their new law preventing women from seeking abortions after 6 weeks. Here's Attorney General Merrick Garland discussing the consequences of that law earlier.
Because the statute makes it too risky for an abortion clinic to stay open, abortion providers have ceased providing services. This leaves women in Texas unable to exercise their constitutional rights and unable to obtain judicial review at the very moment they need it. This kind of scheme to nullify the Constitution of the United States is one that all Americans, whatever their politics or party, should fear. If it prevails, it may become a model for action in other areas, by other states, and with respect to other constitutional rights and judicial precedents.
So we heard a little bit of it there, Sarah, but what exactly is the Biden administration's position here?
The Biden administration is arguing that the Texas law, the way that it's structured, its enforcement mechanism, essentially invalidates the constitutional right to abortion that was enshrined by Roe v. Wade and therefore should be struck down by the courts. And they are pointing the finger at the Supreme Court for not stopping the law when they had a chance when it first went into effect. There's really two big legal questions about the Texas abortion bill. One is about whether a 6-week ban is effectively a total ban on abortion, because it's been said a lot. Many women don't even know they're pregnant by the time they hit the 6-week mark of pregnancy. But the other really interesting and much more untested legal question is this enforcement mechanism that essentially empowers private citizens to be the ones who enforce the law, not the state of Texas. That structure is what allowed the conservative justices on the Supreme Court to let the law stand. Now the Biden Justice Department is looking to get that injunction to put a stop to the enforcement of the law while the two legal questions are worked out. What you heard the Attorney General say there was that if this private citizen, private litigation enforcement mechanism is ultimately declared lawful, then you could see other Republican states and indeed other Democratic states try to apply the same, what critics are calling vigilante justice, to other laws that they might not be able to get on the books through traditional enforcement means. Now, there's also another abortion case that the Supreme Court is preparing to hear that I think is really interesting. It's a Mississippi 15-week ban. And before all this drama with Texas, that's the thing that Democratic abortion advocates were really focusing on, because it presented a real serious threat to abortion rights in that perhaps it could be rolled back from right now the standard is age of viability around 24 weeks. There's a sense that perhaps that is the bridge that the Supreme Court might be more willing to cross. Ultimately, I think there's skepticism that by the time the Texas law makes its way back before the Supreme Court, that it's going to be upheld, because it's just so restrictive. It's such a major departure from the Roe v. Wade standard. And yet I do think that there is a very real risk of that standard being walked back in the next year because of the Mississippi case.
All right, a lot to watch on that front. On another topic, Jackie, a number of progressives were dissatisfied with the climate measures laid out in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. What are they doing to make sure their priorities are included in the budget blueprint?
Yeah, Elaine, we reported earlier this week that one influential climate group, the League of Conservation Voters, for the second time in their storied history, has actually announced that they will not endorse Democratic members that do not get behind the budget, the $3.5 trillion budget blueprint, and support the key climate provisions in that blueprint. Earlier this week, a group of environmental organizations and advocates released the key provisions that they would like to see these members get behind, which ranges from $577 billion to $746 billion in spending overall. And as you noted, a lot of progressives and even some moderates that for that matter, were not happy with the way most of the climate provisions were excluded from the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And they're really banking on being able to achieve these goals in the reconciliation package. Of course, yet again, some of the obstacles that they face are people like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. Manchin has said previously that he does not support a plan that gets fossil fuels down to zero. But that's why you're going to be seeing, I think, in ramp up of outside political pressure from people like LCV, who won't provide support and resources and on the ground help in these swing states like New Hampshire, Arizona, North Carolina, even Texas potentially, for members who are in vulnerable positions right now unless they get behind these provisions. And this announcement comes, I think it's important to note, as Americans are undergoing severe weather crises. We reported earlier this week as well that 1 in 3 Americans are currently undergoing a weather disaster or were hit by a weather disaster this summer, between hurricanes, fires, droughts, floods, all around devastating storms, which the League of Conservation Voters was sure to make the point of in their letter to Democratic members that they issued this week.
All right, well, Sarah Westwood and Jacqueline Alemany, thank you both very much.